Good afternoon and welcome to this review of The Pollinators of Eden by John Boyd. Excuse the terrible lighting. My normal lighting is the sun and it's the wrong time of day, so ta-da. Actually, I have so many tech fails today, it's not funny. I have a tech fail here and I have a tech fail from Android. Android's update still refuses to allow you to read the title. It says John Boyd, The Pollinators of Eden, but you're going to have to trust me for that. Now look at that beautiful cover. That beautiful cover is probably the main reason why I currently own this lovely little penguin science fiction edition. Aside from anything else, when I bought it, it was in mint condition. Since then, it's lived in my bag. It's been read. It's not mint condition anymore, but it's still pretty damn good compared to many of my classic sci-fi second-hand, maybe more like 17th hand books. I did enjoy reading it. So John Boyd, let's start with him. He was an American author in the 60s and the 70s. It was the main pen name for Boyd Bradfield Upchurch, born in 1919 and died in 2013. He seems to have written science fiction for almost exactly 10 years. And I don't know what he did after that, but his first book was The Last Starship from Earth, published in 1968, which I read. Don't remember it too well. I think I remember quite liking it though. And his last book, which was The Penguin as well, 1978, The Girl with the Jade Green Eyes. I'm not sure if I've read that or not. I feel I might have, but I'm not certain. The Raunchy of Heaven, 1969, was what I've always thought his most famous book. That I have read. I owned a copy and it travelled around with me until not only had the cover and the book completely and utterly divorced, but the various pages weren't holding together any longer. And then I let it go in one move. And I'm pretty sure that it was The Raunchy of Heaven that I was looking for when I picked up this book. I saw John Boyd. I sort of pounced on it. The artwork alone, that beautiful classic 70s artwork, which actually isn't too far removed from the actual story. I'd hang that on my wall if I could, and I'm perfectly content with this book just for that. However, so what to say about The Pollinators of Eden? I remember liking the Raunchy of Heaven. He obviously has a bit of a heaven, Eden, earth thing happening there, whatever. I was really surprised by The Pollinators. For a start, there's enough sexual innuendo, double intendos, triple intendos, quadruple intendos, 15,000 power intendos to keep an army of 13-year-olds giggling for all eternity. Seriously, Boyd here never bothers to use any... If there's anything that you can insert, pardon the pun, I've just finished reading this, a double entendre, a sexual reference to, he will do it in this book. I am in awe at this man's ability. For example, there's one point early on where they're discussing recordings of audio recordings, and someone points at the data sheet and goes, "This part looks a bit pregnant," and she goes, "Oh yes, and there it's pregnant to the right." It's like, you know what? Most people would say that they were elevated or increased, but not pregnant. I don't know how an audio recording can be pregnant, but John Boyd, well done. Anyway, the plot is good, but it fails to take itself seriously, so it's probably very much not for everyone as a book. It doesn't take itself seriously. It doesn't always make any sense. It's so full of irony and tongue-in-cheek that your fillings might fall out and a hole might come out through your cheek just reading this thing. I guess you'd say, overall, the one thing you could most commonly call this book is botanically raunchy. A combination of two words that I would not normally have considered. Anyway, plot in synopsis. It starts with a United States spaceship called Botany returning from a planet called Flora, the flower planet. Dr. Frida Karan, who's a up-and-coming cystologist from the Bureau of Exotic Plants, is standing there waiting for her fiancé, Paul something or other, who's been on Flora researching orchids, apparently. It would have to be orchids, wouldn't it? The one flower that everyone seems to think is sexually suggestive. I mean, I probably thought it was sexually suggestive when I was 13 too, but whatever. Cytologist. I meant to look this up earlier. Diagnostic cytology is the study of cells, but that isn't what Frida Karan is. She's a cystologist, and I can't see that that's a real thing. There's cystoscopy, but that's probably not it. Yeah. Cytology, yes. Cystoscopy, I think he just invented it. He invented plenty of other things after all. Okay, so she's waiting there for Paul, but he hasn't come back. Instead, he sends a student of his called Hal with a semi-intact seed of an orchid, a whole heap of seeds or plants of tulips, which she's named after her, and a whole heap of wildly insane theories about the planet of Flora. The core idea seems to be that the plants there are not only further evolved than most than Earth's plants, but actually intelligent and communicate and whatever. Flora has no insects, so the pollinators of Flora cannot be insects because there aren't any. The pollinators for these tulips are apparently a koala shrew type animal. So there are mammals. One thing I noticed early on about this book that I have noticed in earlier books from the 60s and the 70s is, but by the 80s, science fiction authors weren't doing this so much. They call things by earth names. So these are tulips. They are allegedly tulips. They aren't tulips. They're from a different planet, so they can't be tulips. Tulips are bulbs originating on Earth. These aren't tulips. Orchids, likewise. If they're on another star, they're not orchids because orchids evolved on Earth. Koalas and shrews, there's dolphins in the oceans. There's not. Dolphins originated on Earth. Anyway, it's a thing they used to do in the 60s and 70s in science fiction. I'm glad they don't do it anymore. The zoologist and the scientist in me rebels. The scientist in me had to cope with a lot during this book. Because the language is so wild and the suppositions are so off the wall, you can't tell what's insane imagination or what's based on real. I would say that most of the science is based on wholly on John Boyd's imagination. And well, he knows enough of psychology. There's a lot of psychology in the last, there's a lot of botany in the beginning, there's a lot of psychology at the end. I think he knows enough of psychology to have read Fromm's theories, Jung's theories, and Freud's theories, all of which I've also read a certain amount of. He goes way into them, but I think that probably a lot of the psychology in there is as wildly unsuited to reality as the rest. Okay, so Frida and Hal start putting together these tulips in growing them in glass houses in the Bureau of Exotic Plants. They do so with what's allegedly scientific notation and investigation. It just seems like wild planting to me. In the meantime, Hal is courting Frida, who keeps rambling on to us about how she's scared of intimacy or whatever, and I really don't care about Frida's intimacy. Eventually, Frida does manage to get to the planet of Flora, where she finds that her fiance Paul has gone native and is having sex with orchids. And the culmination of the whole thing is that Frida herself has sex with a female orchid, and then she has sex with a male orchid. And it's like, oh my god. It's written in the 60s. What can I say? This is very, very written in the 60s. I think that got me. It's hard to really take issue with anything in here because there's so little that actually even borders on reality, and it's so full of humor, irony, sexual innuendo about anything that you can possibly imagine, and many, many things that you can't imagine. I certainly didn't imagine, but Boyd could. The whole thing is wild. You basically have to put your logical brain on hold and either enjoy it or not. The first third, I sometimes liked it, I sometimes didn't. Took a lot of issue with the scientific methodology and the botanical experimentation didn't ring too true. I have read people who reviewed this book and said it was like reading a botany textbook or like doing biology lessons. I've got to say they went to a strange school of science, but you know, there's weird things in there. Paul sent Frida these tulips, which ended up killing people. On page 177, he says, I suppose you had to destroy them. So he sent them to her, knowing they were potentially very dangerous. Why did you send them to me, dear fiance? Is exactly what Frida does not say, because they're all batshit crazy. They're batshit crazy in a pretty interesting way, I've got to say. Okay, so I'm not going to read you from the actual book, but the preface to the Penguin edition that was written by John Boyd in 1978 has a few interesting little quirks. I feel like this preface to the Penguin edition is so generic that he basically wrote it for Penguin to attach to any of his books that they happen to publish, because it touches at least slightly on many of his books. So the mythic connections of man's fall from grace were at work on his first novel. That is the Earth one, The Last Spaceship from Earth, which he describes as having been very strongly influenced by The Green Hills of Earth by Heinlein. Excellent collection of stories. I thoroughly recommend it. Because that worked for him, in his second, he borrowed from the myth of Phaedra, which I personally don't remember. I don't remember the myth of Phaedra at all. He named his heroine Frida, and apparently Phaedra's younger illicit lover was called Hippolina, so he makes the foil for the younger lover Hal Pollino, who's the student that comes back from Paul on Flora. He culled one of the tale's climactic speeches almost intact from Racine's Phaedra, and why not? He took the idea from Euripides. I haven't read Racine nor heard of him, so I don't know which speech it was. Euripides, I do know who they are, but only a little bit. Boyd obviously likes Euripides a lot. He quotes from him several times therein. Blah 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 blah. Other stuff. This introduction is actually quite interesting to anyone who's reading John Boyd, and having read this and not hated it, at times very much enjoyed it, I'm inclined to get more Boyd. I definitely want to reread The Last Spaceship from Earth and The Rake-Hells of Heaven. I might go with The Girls with the Jade Green Eyes if I can find them. It's a question of finding them at this time. So it was hard. He said he found it hard to put together a unified style for the Pollinators of Eden. The last book he'd read before beginning it was Oriana Fallacies When the Sun Dies. Never heard of it. His stylistic tricks kept popping up from my subconscious like plums from Jack Horner's pudding, so I used them too. His writing is fruity, even in the introduction. That stylistic inconsistency, I'm going to say, is notable in this book. It's a really up and down stylistically book. You're reading it, and from one paragraph to another, you get completely wild jumps and variations in your reading experience. So it's good that he recognizes it. It's not a terrible result, but it definitely slows down in the last half or 2/3. That was when I started really enjoying this book, because no matter how crazy the things it was saying, how unlikely the individuals, I can't even call them characters, they were fully mamas on Greek theatre, but they were consistent at least. In the classic myth of Phaedra, blah blah blah, she does stuff, she does whatever. So in creating Frida, the thinking man's ideal woman who could quote Shakespeare while making love, not that she ever did make love because she was thoroughly repressed, but apparently he fell in love with his own character so much that he couldn't let her be strangled. So in fact, she has a happy ending of sorts, batshit crazy, but happy. Eventually, John Wyndham solved the problem, apparently. When Frida finally yielded, it was to a lesbian orchid on the planet of ambulatory plants. I don't think that that's actually correct. Frida had sex with a lot of orchids on Flora, and at least one of them was male, so... Is this a queer romance? It might be a queer romance. Of course, the other half of the romance is actually a plant, but it's a female plant, so, oh God. It's such a crazy book, it's made me crazy too. Okay, the author also loved the paradox in the title, The Pollinators of Eden. Logically, there could have been no pollinators in Eden. Once Adam and Eve discovered this process of reproduction, there was no longer an Eden, and they were ejected from the garden for their sin. Boyd's got some weird relationships with religion, and that comes through in the book as well. He's got some weird relationships with civilization, certainly in the 60s, and that comes through in the books. It looks to me like the man had way too much time suffering in institutions from administration and committees, and that comes across in the book. It's certainly a bit unique and a bit weird. There's a lot of weird. I did enjoy it far more in the second half than in the first half, and far more as it went along. I became more invested. It's a short book. I think it's only 212 pages, but it took a long time to read because there's so much that's batshit crazy about it. You're not always sure what you're reading, and you have to go slow to figure out what's happening. Very much suited to people who like reading sciencey things because it's heavy on the science. It's just the science isn't maths and astrophysics. It's much more botany and psychology. But yeah, The Pollinators of Eden. Very strange book by what I suspect is a very strange author, which I would very much like to read more of now, somehow. Thank you for watching. Once again, I apologise for the reversed image that the Android update has given us. I apologise for the appalling electric light because the sun has failed, and I shall do better in terms of reviewing next time. Thank you for watching. Comment if you like. Read good books. They're good for you.